because I just wanted to truly wait for real inspiration and revelation to manifest itself. And over the course of those weeks, the Lord began to speak to me about the days that we're living in, the times that we're living in, and this epochal shift, this paradigm shift that we are learning to inhabit God as God inhabits us. So today we are beginning this brand new 6-week journey, a series that we are calling the Ecology of Abiding. So over the next 6 weeks, we're going to really truly dismantle probably some of the most exhausting, heavy, and burdensome paradigms that have attached themselves to the Christian faith. And I believe that we're going to recover something truly. Excuse me here, I wanted to turn this down because I want to keep up with the chat. Excuse me. I believe that we are truly going to recover some things that I would consider to be absolutely breathtakingly beautiful. I want to welcome Cassie and Ryan in this morning. Thank you for being here this morning, my precious kids from Savannah, Georgia. Thank you, Norman and Colette, for being here. And ain't nothing like Jesus is here. I'm here. It's good to have you in this morning, all of you. Thank you. I know that there's some more that are watching and coming in as we kind of get started here. I want to state right at the outset that we're really not introducing a new doctrine today. But I believe that we're really recovering a very old one. And what we are doing over these next 6 weeks is what I would consider biblical archaeology, because we're digging down through centuries of cultural sediment. We're digging through layers of Roman law. We're digging through layers of Greek philosophy. We're digging through Enlightenment rationalism and modern corporate management theory. We are digging through all of that to discover the original bedrock of the truly biblical worldview. Because somewhere along the way, family, I believe that we lost the plot. I believe that we even lost the plot of what salvation actually is. We lost the plot of what holiness actually means. And most importantly, we lost the plot of who God actually is and how he relates to us. So as a result of that, we have produced a generation, and dare I say, even multiple generations of leaders, pastors, and believers who are profoundly and fundamentally exhausted. If you're a leader, if you're a parent, if you're a believer that's simply trying to navigate the complexities of this cultural moment and environment that we have been so immersed in, and you feel this deep spiritual fatigue, a fatigue that is good night's sleep just does not fix. I want you to lean into this today, because that exhaustion is not a sign that you are failing, and I don't want you to take it like that. That exhaustion is a diagnostic indicator that the paradigm you are operating within is broken. For centuries, Western Christian theology and leadership formation have been trapped in a pendulum swing between two dominant paradigms. Now, I call this the exhaustion of the binary. On one side of the pendulum, we have the Hellenistic, Reformed legal framework. On the other side, we have the charismatic, experiential framework. But let's begin today by looking at the first one, or what we have called the legal framework. Now, in this swing of the paradigm, God is primarily viewed as a judge. The courtroom is the dominant metaphor for reality. Salvation is understood almost exclusively as a forensic legal transaction, an acquittal in the courts of divine justice. God's honor has been offended, a debt must be paid, and Jesus pays the debt so that the judge can declare you not guilty with the swing of a hammer, a gavel. Now, is there biblical precedent for the courtroom metaphor? Yes, that is true. Absolutely. I would be disingenuous to say anything other. The Apostle Paul uses the Greek word dikaio, which means to justify or acquit. He uses that letter almost famously in his letter specifically to the Romans. Now, isn't that interesting? To the Romans, the legal, lawful, governmental, empirical agency of the time. But now, here is the critical historical context that most of us 2,000 years later have completely missed. Paul was writing into a Roman culture that was obsessed with law and what we would call jurisprudence. And he was using a metaphor that they lived in, dwelt in, so ultimately understood. But here's a fascinating fact that is not debatable even. It was one metaphor among at least 10 different metaphors that Paul used to describe salvation. Now, I want that to set right there with you a moment. It was only one among 10 different ones that Paul used to describe salvation. One among 10. The courtroom, lawful, legalistic metaphor of justification and acquittal was used 1/10 of the time. But the problem occurred when the church fathers, particularly in the West, took that one metaphor and made it an entire salvific, would be the word, salvific framework. Now, Tertullian, writing around the year 200 AD, was one of the first major theologians to interpret the work of Christ almost entirely in juridical, legal categories. And it makes perfect sense when you study history, as we all should, and realize that Tertullian was trained, guess what? As a Roman lawyer. And then centuries later, do you hear what I just said? Centuries. See, sometimes we forget about the time scope of what has gone on. Centuries later, what would amount to more than the United States of America has been a nation. Centuries later, Anselm of Canterbury codified this in the West through a theological concept that is defined as satisfaction. The idea of that is that God's honor required simply a just payment. So what happened? Anselm gave us a God who looks like a Roman magistrate. Carrie and Paige are in the house. It's wonderful to see you guys. Thank you. Anselm gave us a God who looks like a Roman magistrate. But the Hebrew scriptures, Psalm 23, gave us a God who looks like a shepherd. Family, when the courtroom becomes the only lens through which you view God, the psychological result is a performance-based identity. If righteousness is a legal standing that must be maintained by behavioral compliance, which is what law demands, then you are forced into image management. It is a subsequent outcome. It is simply a consequence. You cannot afford to be broken. You cannot afford to fail. You are forced into the word that I've taught you in the past, duplicity. Hiding your failures to maintain the appearance of the legal standard. But it's only image curation, image management. This produces the unbalanced yoke, the leavened liability, the crushing weight of perfectionism, which ultimately produces shame, and ultimately it produces leaders, which is more prolific today than ever. It produces leaders who are terrified of being found out. Let me ask you this question this morning. Let's see who's got the courage to answer this question. Let's see who's got the courage to maybe even put something in the chat that would be transparent and help us to understand that could produce a wave of vulnerability that could help a lot of people. But let me ask this provocative question right now. In what ways have you experienced the exhaustion of the courtroom or the concert hall? The courtroom, performance, compliance. The concert hall, emotional intensity in your own leadership or spiritual journey. Because let's talk about this emotional intensity, or what I call the concert hall, and how the pendulum swings in the experiential charismatic framework. So reacting against the cold, rigid performance anxiety of the legal framework, the church began to swing the pendulum all the way to the other side, which is what I refer to as the charismatic, the charismaniacal, the charismaniacal experiential framework. Now, in this framework, the church rightfully recovered the immediacy of the Holy Spirit. They began to declare loudly, God is not a distant judge. He is a present reality. But in their reaction, they often reduced the divine to simply an encounter or an experience or simply a feeling brought on by the right music and the right place with the lights dimmed low. And the concert hall replaced the courtroom. I like how Cassie writes, recovering perfectionist right here. So many of us fit into that category, Sissy. In our reaction to the paradigm of legalism and performance, in our infantilism, we swung it all the way to the other end, the other side, going right and left, to where that we simply reduced God to an encounter or an experience or just simply emotional intensity defined as the presence of God. When God is framed primarily as an experience, your spiritual health, once again, is simply measured by the intensity of your emotions in that moment. If you felt goosebumps during worship, God was there. If you wept at the altar, God was moving. But if you felt dry or numb on a Tuesday afternoon, you must have lost your connection in some way, some form. Or worse, you have hidden sin. The psychological result of a purely experiential theology is this. Buckle up, folks, because this is going to get very dynamic. The psychological result of a pure experiential theology is a profound instability. It's called tossed to and fro by every wind and wave. Leaders burn out because they cannot sustain the emotional voltage required to prove that God is present. I can show you many places that exists today, that very thing. You cannot live your entire life at the crest of an adrenaline wave, a dopamine hit. Furthermore, the community becomes an event to attend rather than a habitat to dwell in. People start chasing the next conference, the next revival, the next big name prophet, the next deliverance ministry, the next emotional high. Why? Because they are addicted to the experience of God rather than learning to dwell in the environment of God. The courtroom produces image management and shame, but the concert hall produces burnout and instability, and both are exhausting. And elsewhere, both are incomplete. Both have reached a point of absolute exhaustion in modern leadership formation. And I want to pause here and be very pastoral for a moment, because I know that some of you are sitting at this table right now. And I know that some of you are carrying the weight of one or perhaps even both of these paradigms. Some of you became leaders in the church because you genuinely loved God. No question about that. Somewhere along the way, that love got buried under a mountain of expectations, standards, performance metrics. You started leading for God. And then you started leading for the approval of God. And these are very different things. And the distance between those two postures is the distance between rest and exhaustion. Others of you came out of a tradition that was rich with the presence of God. Genuine encounters, real moves of the Spirit, moments that were absolutely authentic. But over time, the experience became the gold rather than the fruit. And you started measuring your spiritual health by the frequency and intensity of your encounters. When the encounter became less frequent because life got complicated, because grief entered the room, because the season changed, you interpreted that silence as divine disapproval. You thought God had moved on. He had not. You had simply been given the invitation to move from the concert hall into the garden. Now, both of these, family, are deeply human responses to a genuine longing for God. I am not dismissing either tradition, but I am saying that both paradigms, when they become the entire framework, leave us impoverished. They leave us with a God who is either too far away to reach unless we perform correctly, or too volatile to trust unless we feel the right things. Neither of those is the God we see in John chapter 15. This brings us to the core thesis of this entire 6-week series. We are articulating a third framework. This is the plumb line 7 paradigm shift that I am speaking about on every single platform I'm writing about. I'm doing articles, everything, because it is that important. And we're calling it ecological theology. This is the paradigm shift that returns us to the ancient participatory root of the biblical narrative. And here is the thesis. Write this down. I would encourage you. Take a picture of it and let it sink in deeply. As a matter of fact, I have even seen other people that I don't hardly know, beginning to post in the last 2 weeks on social media about this. Other people are catching it. And here is the thesis. God is not primarily a judge to be satisfied, nor merely an experience to be felt. God is an environment to be inhabited. I'm going to say that again because it changes everything about how you lead, how you parent, how you are an employee or an employer, how you speak with people, your relationships with your spouse, children, one another, how you pray, how you communicate. God is not primarily a judge to be satisfied, nor merely an experience to be felt. He is an environment to be inhabited. When Jesus is preparing to leave his disciples in John chapter 15, he does not give them a legal code to follow. He does not give them an emotional state to maintain. He gives them an ecological metaphor. Listen to it. I don't know that we've ever defined it this way. An ecological metaphor. Listen, John 15:4. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. Now, the Greek word here, translated as abide, is the Greek word meno. It means to remain, to dwell, to take up residence, to inhabit. The branch does not strive to produce fruit. The branch does not wake up in the morning and say, I need to work harder today to prove I am a good branch. The branch does not attend the next greatest prophetic conference to get an emotional high and hopefully a word so it can squeeze out a grape. The branch simply remains attached to the life force. This is ecology. It inhabits the environment of the vine. Because here's the thing that is going to shock you that I'm going to say. Fruit is not the goal. Fruit is the ecological evidence of abiding. It's simply a subsequent consequence. When you shift from a legal framework to an ecological framework, you don't have to declare that grapes are going to appear. In other words, the pressure to perform simply evaporates. When you shift from an experiential framework to an ecological framework, the pressure to manufacture an emotion evaporates. You are simply invited to take up residence in the habitat called grace. Anybody feeling this morning? So before we go further, I want to establish some vocabulary. See, we need to change our language because there is a new language for a new day, a purified language for a purified people, according to Zephaniah 3:9, who will call on the Lord with one consent, standing shoulder to shoulder. So I want to establish the new day vocabulary, the fiat language of God. Because we are going to be working definitively with the original biblical languages in this series. These are not academic exercises. These are precision instruments. The difference between the Hebrew and Greek words in these texts is the difference between a life of striving and a life of abiding. The first word I want to talk to you about this morning is ra'ah. And it's spelled with 2 letters in the Hebrew that are very specific, and another one, it's a 3-letter compound consonant. And it's spelled resh, ayin, hey in Hebrew. Resh, ayin, hey. It means to see. It means to behold. But something even more important, it means to understand or perceive what one is looking at. It's not a picture of the puppy with his head twisted sideways trying to figure out what he's looking at. It's not a picture of the cow looking at the new gate trying to figure out what in the world is this thing. It is a contemplative gaze. That means to perceive what one is beholding. The eyes and the mind working congruently together. Now, watch this. Let's go all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. It is here where it says that Eve saw the tree. And it uses this word, ra'ah. And when John 15:19 says that Jesus only does what he sees the Father doing, in that very place, it uses the equivalent Greek concept that was used in the Septuagint, which is the Greek writings of the Hebrew Old Testament that was written and completed by 132 BC by Jewish scholars writing in the language of the learned of the day, which was Greek. So ultimately, this is what this means in a very simplified Feynman method type sentence, if you will, for those of you who know what that is. It means the quality of your seeing determines the quality of your perception and ultimately the quality of your living. Now that's quite prominent. Now the second word is da'at. And it's spelled using the dalet, the ayin, and the tav. It means knowledge. But it's not intellectual knowledge. It's the word where we would use to say the intimate, relational knowing. In other words, this is the same word that is used when the text says that Adam knew Eve and produced a son. It is the knowledge of union, not simply the gathering of information. So watch this. When the serpent offered Eve the knowledge of good and evil, he was not offering her a new theology. He was not offering her an upgraded degree. He was offering her a counterfeit intimacy. Ouch. Think about what I just said. He was offering her an emotional encounter that would replace true intimacy. Therefore, it was a counterfeit. And what did it produce? It produced the illusion of self-sufficiency. Now, the third word, dikaiō. Dikaiō. I've already spoke to you about this. This is the Greek word from Paul's letters meaning to justify or acquit. Now, this is what we would define as a forensic or a legal term. As I said earlier, it is a real biblical metaphor, but it is only one metaphor among many. And because of that, we must hold it in its proper proportion. To do anything else would be illegitimate and produce an illegitimate framework. And the fourth word that we're going to unpack in detail all the way probably in session 3 is the word meno, the word that I spoke to you about earlier, which Jesus uses in John 15:14, that means to dwell, to take up residence, to inhabit. This is the ecological word. This is the word that changes everything. How does that word, for those of you who are watching, and there are several today, how does that word change everything? How many of you have ever thought of this word as an ecological word? How many of you ever thought of God as an environment in which we live, move, and have our being? That God is so immense, that God is person, God is mind and consciousness, but God is also environment. God is all things. Because all things were made by him and for him and exist through him and to him. But this word of habitation, this word of residence, this word of dwelling, meno, it literally changes everything about our concepts of theological ecology. Now, I want to talk to you about the Genesis exhaustion and the perceptual fall. I want you to remember that term. Because to understand how we got so far away from this ecological reality, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. We have to go back to Genesis, specifically chapters 2 and 3. And there we will find an amazing picture of this, what I am calling the perceptual fall. Most of us have been taught, Norman, Colette, Carrie, Paige, Cassie, Ryan, all of us that grew up in Western evangelicalism, we've all been taught that the original sin in the Garden of Eden was simply a matter of breaking a rule. God gave us a command. Adam and Eve broke the command. The judge brought the gavel down, and the legal framework was born. Cha-ching, cha-ching, in, out, go to jail, go directly to jail, do not pass go, do not collect anything except a free ticket to hell. But if we look closely, if we do some archaeological work, if we dig a little bit deeper, we begin to see something much more prominent, much more subtle, and ultimately much more devastating. Watch this. Genesis 2:9 tells us, And out of the ground, the Lord God made to spring up every tree that is pleasant to the sight, good for food. The tree of life was in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Notice the order in that verse. God causes trees to grow that are pleasant to the sight and good for food. The visual aesthetic, watch, pleasant to the sight, the visual aesthetic is listed before the utilitarian function. Pleasant to the sight, the visual aesthetic, good for food, utilitarian function. The beauty precedes the usefulness. Now, the tree of the knowledge, and I bet I'm going to say some things that you have never heard before. The tree of knowledge of good and evil was placed in the center of the garden. Now, while the other trees were given for food, this specific tree, in other words, was given for food, utilitarian. This specific tree was uniquely restricted from consumption. In other words, the prohibition was on the utilitarian function. So, logically, we deduce if it was not for eating, the question has to be, what was its purpose? Anybody hearing me? Ding, ding. If it wasn't for eating, why was it there? Why put it in the center of the garden? Anybody got any ideas? The linguistic structure of the text speaks something to us. That when we begin to do some of this archaeological work that I'm talking about, it suggests that its primary function would be considered visual and contemplative, not utilitarian. It was placed in the center, in other words, to simply be beheld, looked at, contemplated, perceived. It stood, though, as a physical boundary marker of creaturely limitation and divine sovereignty working together. Why? Why, you ask? To look upon it was to be reminded of the order of reality. Somebody write that down, please. To look upon it, it was contemplative, visual. To look upon it was to be reminded of the order of reality. Let all things be done decently and in order. It was an object of contemplation. And what was that contemplation? It was to be a continuous reminder that God is God and creature is creature. Creator is creator, creature is creature. God is God, humanity is humanity. But then we get to Genesis chapter 3. And here the serpent enters. The temptation occurs. And a fundamental shift happens in the human consciousness. Look at Genesis 3:6. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave to her husband who was with her, and he ate also. The Hebrew word for saw here is the word that I spoke of earlier, ra'ah. It means to see, to behold, to perceive. But in this moment, the act of seeing becomes corrupted. Eve no longer sees the tree as an object of divine contemplation. She no longer looks at it to remember who God is. Instead, she projects her own thought on it and turns it into a utilitarian object. She projects a utilitarian evaluation. In other words, it is no longer esteemed, it is simply only good to be consumed. Now, as scholars have noted, human beings cannot visually determine if a fruit is good for food simply by looking at it. There are things out there that look good that you can eat that will kill you. What was going on? What was happening? It's this. Think about what I just read to you in Genesis 3:6. Eve is projecting the serpent's lie onto that physical object. She has ceased to stand in awe of the mystery of being, what we would call ontological worship, and instead she views the tree as her own tool for her own self-determination and empowerment. It's exactly what we have done to worship in the 21st century. Ouch. Somebody go ahead and scream, "God forgive me," right now. That'd be a great place to do it. We've ceased to stand in awe of the ontological mystery of being, and instead we have viewed this tree simply as a tool. It looks good, it tastes good, and it will make us wise. It's a tool for our own self-determination and empowerment. She looks at the tree and says, "What can this do for me? How can I use it to become wise?" Watch this. How can I consume this to elevate myself? This is the perceptual fall. It is an ontological category error. She looked at something that was meant to simply be beheld as an image of divine order, and she demanded that it produce something for her. This is the very essence of idolatry, reducing the sacred simply to the common. The medieval Jewish scholar Ramban, who was also known as Nachmanides, offers a profound commentary on this moment. He argues that before eating, Humanity acted in accordance with their pure nature, doing what is true without internal conflict. Think about that. He offers that before the eating of this, before the reducing this to the utilitarian function, humanity acted in accordance always with simply their pure nature, doing what is true without the internal conflict, without the internal fight. In other words, without flesh fighting spirit. But the fruit of the tree introduced a new kind of da'at. It was a new kind of knowing that was untethered from relational alignment with God. Before the fall, good and evil were distinct. There were external realities that humanity could observe and navigate from a place of rest. After the fall, good and evil became hopelessly intertwined within the human psyche. The mixture entered the soul. This is why leadership and just even being a believer and living in society today is so complicated. We are not simply dealing here, my friends, with external moral choices. We are dealing with an internal mixture, a psyche in which the desire to serve God and the desire to serve self are so deeply intertwined that we often cannot tell them apart. We build ministries that we say are for God that are really, truly, simply for our own validation. We preach the grace of God while living under the law of performance. We proclaim freedom while remaining imprisoned by image management. This is why the Lord led me to build, starting a couple of years ago, the plumb line assessment system. I began to see 2 years ago what was going to happen only by the grace of God in the rest of the decade as the therapeutic culture and the celebrity culture began to crumble, the deconstruction that Abba was going to do in the tearing down of our Babel. And here we are standing amidst the rubble today. And this is why the Lord prompted me 2 years ago to start building the plumb line assessment system, because it exists precisely to help those who are called to leadership, who are called to spiritual shepherding, begin to help them to navigate this internal mixture. Because it is not a tool of condemnation. It is an instrument of discernment. It is a plumb line, like the one God set in the midst of his people in Amos 7:8. The plumb line does not tear down a wall. It reveals what must be realigned. And realignment, my friends, is always an act of grace. It's not judgment. So I want you to answer this question. I'd love to see some of your comments from all of you who are watching today. Think about this. Once again, do you have the courage to answer these questions? How does viewing the fall in Genesis chapter 3 as a perceptual error, a shift from beholding to consuming, change your understanding of sin and restoration. Now, here's the big question. Where do you see utilitarian consumerism, utilitarian consumption showing up in your own life? Are you sitting here today listening to Robin simply because you can eat and eat and eat and get filled and satisfy the desire of your own flesh? Are you eating here? Are you sitting here eating to be equipped and empowered to go and do the assignment, to complete the assignment that God has given to you? Are you going to walk out of here going, boy, that was such good teaching, and then 2 hours from now not have a clue and forget, couldn't even remember the scriptures that I give you? Welcome to most modern day Sunday morning services. Oh, that was great church today. Oh man, we had great church today. Man, the move of God was so powerful. Well, what was it about? What did it? Oh, I don't remember. I couldn't tell you. Welcome to modern Pentecostalism. Well, we had great church. It was good. The Lord was present. The Spirit was moving. Well, what was it? Oh, I don't know. I couldn't tell you. See, that's utilitarian consumption. That's simply modernistic consumerism, masked in spiritual language. It has nothing to do with the principle of abiding. Why does this ancient story matter for us today, folks? Because this is the exact same perceptual error that drives exhaustion, whether it's in leadership, parenting, so many different arenas that we dwell and abide in today. It's the perceptual error that drives the exhaustion. When you lose the ability to behold the sacred, when you lose the capacity for contemplative alignment, you default to what you've always done before. And what is that? Utilitarian consumption. Consumerism for the sake of consumerism. The Bible refers to those as swine. You start looking at everything in your life and asking, what can this do for me? Pastors and leaders do this all the time. We look at our ministries, and instead of beholding them as environments of grace, we view them as utilitarian objects to be consumed, to produce success, to produce metrics, to produce some kind of validation. We look at our congregations, and instead of seeing the living souls as they are, we just simply see attendance numbers and giving units. And here's the sad thing. We even look at our own souls, and instead of resting in the imago Dei, the image of God within us, we treat our own bodies and minds as machines to be optimized for maximum output. We have traded the peace of contemplation for the anxiety of utilitarian control. We are grasping, taking, and using, just like Eve in the garden, and it is exhausting. This is what the plumb line assessment system is designed to address. When we assess leaders, pastors, teachers, apostles, prophets, whatever you decide nomenclature fits on you, I guess. When you assess them through the plumb line, we are not looking for diagnostic flaws to condemn. We are looking at the psychological lens, things like cognition, identity, and woundedness. We are asking, is this leader's self-understanding rooted in performance or in formation? Are they operating from a utilitarian mindset, using their ministry to produce validation? Or are they operating from a contemplative alignment, resting in the environment of God? If the fall was a shift from beholding to consuming, then redemption must be a reversal of that shift. It must be a return to the contemplative alignment. This is why we have to have a Christological reinstatement. The theology of the last Adam, not the second, the last. Because if he was the second Adam, it means there could be a third. But as the last Adam, it means there will be no other. And this is exactly what we see in the life of Jesus, the last Adam. In John 5:19, Jesus makes one of the most profound statements about his own operational framework when he says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, the Son does likewise." Now, I want you to notice that language, only what he sees the Father doing. Now, the Greek word there for seeing is the funny sounding little word blepo. B-L-E-P-O would be the transliterated spelling in English. Blepo. But it carries the same weight as the Hebrew word ra'ah. Jesus is saying, my action flows entirely from my perception. I do not initiate. I do not strive. I behold the Father, and my action is simply an echo of what I see. Eve looked at the tree, stopped beholding, and initiated her own action based on her desire for consumption. Jesus looks at the Father, maintains his contemplative gaze, and acts only in alignment with that environment. In other words, Jesus was not operating in a legal framework trying to earn the Father's approval. At his baptism, before he had performed a single miracle or preached a single sermon, the Father spoke from heaven and said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." The approval preceded the performance. Jesus was not also operating in a purely experiential framework, chasing emotional highs. He spent 40 days in the wilderness fasting. He prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane until he sweat great drops of blood. He did not always feel a euphoric emotional connection, but he remained ecologically aligned with the Father's will. He inhabited the environment of the Father. And because he inhabited that environment, the fruit of his life was the salvation of the world. Yeshua said, "I only do what I see my Father do," in John 5:19. What would it look like for you this week to lead, to parent, to work, to minister from that posture of contemplative alignment rather than strategic initiative? As we close this first session today, I want to leave you with a diagnostic question for your own soul. Are you breathing the air of grace, or are you suffocating under performance anxiety? If you are exhausted today, I want to suggest that you might be trying to satisfy a judge who has already acquitted you. Or you might be trying to manufacture an experience that you cannot sustain. We've all been guilty of these. This is not uncommon to any of us. And if every one of us watching today would tell the truth, we've all found ourselves swinging on this binary, the pendulum, as I say. The invitation of John 15, though, is not to try harder. The invitation is not feel more. The invitation is to be transplanted. It is an invitation to step out of the courtroom, to step out of the concert hall, and take up residence in a place called a garden. God is an environment to be inhabited. Stop striving to produce fruit and simply focus your attention on your already connectedness to the vine. The ecology of abiding will take care of all of the rest. Next week, in session 2, we're going to look at the Hebrew concept of tome. I've introduced it some in the last few weeks. It's the word for integrity. We're going to discover that the opposite of integrity is not failure, it is duplicity. And we're going to see how the speed of your return to the Father is the true measure of your spiritual health. But for this week, your only assignment is this: abide, dwell, inhabit, rest in the environment of His grace. Thank you for joining me today on Sunday Morning Table Talks. If you are not a subscriber to the YouTube channel, check out every Tuesday at 7:40 a.m. a new episode of Connecting the Dots drops. I'm excited that so many people are paying attention and hearing these words of the hour. I want to thank all of you who have stayed in today, who have watched this, for being a part of this today. You're beautiful souls, and I bless you according to the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit. Catch us Wednesday mornings at 10 a.m. for Wednesday morning conversations. Where we are engaging a fascinating subject called the shield of humility. God's divine favor as covering. So thank you all again. God bless you. And I pray peace, shalom, wholeness on your lives today. We'll see you soon.